Uncanny Valley, Chapter 4, The Church That Does Not Pray. The night was thick with silence, the kind that pressed in from all sides, swallowing even the whisper of the wind. Orson lay in bed, half asleep, drifting in the uneasy space between waking and dreaming. The house settled around him, its wooden bones creaking in the cold. Orson's breath evened out before being jolted back to waking. A sound, distant and hollow. A bell. A single chime, so faint it might have been imagined. Yet it cut through the stillness like a breath against the back of his neck. Orson's body stiffened, his pulse quickening. He strained his ears, waiting for a second toll. None came. Just the one. Orson exhaled. The sound faded. Sleep took him, though it was not restful. The morning light was a sickly, pale thing, seeping through the curtains like spoiled milk. Orson woke with a start, a dull ache settling deep in his skull. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, the last remnants of some forgotten dream curling away like smoke. He sat up, rubbing his face before swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The floorboards were cold beneath his feet. His eyes caught on something strange. Small, brittle fragments littering the blanket. Leaves. Orson frowned, brushing them away with slow, deliberate fingers. They were dry, curled at the edges like they had been plucked from the ground and left to wither. He turned his gaze to the floor, his stomach tightening. Mud. Faint streaks of dried mud trailed across the wooden planks, leading towards the door. He followed them with his eyes, breath catching in his throat. His boots, neatly placed by the door the night before, were speckled with dirt, their soles caked in dried earth. Orson swallowed. He did not remember going outside. The kitchen smelled of dust and stale air, as if the house had been holding its breath while he slept. He moved on autopilot, filling the kettle, setting it to boil. The silence clung to him, a heavy, expectant thing. As he reached for the cupboard, his fingers stilled. Something was pinned to the fridge. A newspaper clipping, old, yellowed with time. It fluttered slightly as he moved closer, as though something had just placed it there. He didn't remember seeing it before. The headline was barely legible, the ink smudged with age, but he could still make out the words. Tragedy at First Church of Uncanny Valley. Bell tower claims a life. A death. Someone had died at the church. The details were murky, the print too faded to read in some places. Then he noticed the tear, a jagged rip at the bottom of the clipping where the name of the victim should have been. Orson's fingers curled slightly at the edge of the paper. The kettle screamed, a sharp, shrill whistle. He exhaled, blinking hard, and turned away from the clipping. The air outside carried the weight of an oncoming storm, thick and damp, though no rain had fallen. Orson walked without direction, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, his feet moving as if drawn by invisible strings. The town stretched quiet and still around him. The buildings leaned inward, their facades worn with time. At some point, he became aware of his surroundings, of where he was going. His pulse quickened. The road beneath him was unfamiliar, not in the way a stranger might find a new street, but in the way something should be familiar and yet wasn't. The church loomed ahead. It sat at the end of the street like a forgotten relic, its steeple stretching toward the dull sky, the wooden boards weathered and splintered, the bell nowhere to be seen. The windows were dark, fogged over with something thicker than dust. Orson's footsteps slowed. The air felt different here, thinner, stretched. A movement in his periphery. He turned his head. A woman passed him on the sidewalk, her expression vacant, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She did not acknowledge him. Another man, further down the street, the same. Their bodies stiff, their gazes empty. No one looked at the church. No one looked at him. And yet, the air around him felt full of eyes. Orson swallowed hard, his breath unsteady. He did not remember deciding to come here, and yet here he was. The wind stirred, though the trees did not move. The bell tower loomed above, and somewhere deep in his bones, Orson Glass knew the bell had rung for him. Orson hesitated at the threshold. The windows were clouded, but not with dust or condensation. A thick, waxen film coated the glass as though something had melted and congealed there over time. The texture reminded him of candle drippings, except it was the wrong color. Not ivory, but yellowed, almost flesh-toned. The doors were ajar, cracked open just enough to invite him in, or dare him to. The wind did not stir. The air here was thick, unmoving. He placed a hand against the wooden door and pushed. It gave easily, swinging inward on silent hinges. Inside, the air was cold, unnaturally so, a sharp contrast to the humid weight outside. And the church was not empty. Rows of figures sat in the pews, their backs to him. Orson stopped short, his breath catching in his throat. The congregation. At first, they looked like people, still, reverent, waiting. They filled the pews, each seated in an almost identical posture, their hands resting in their laps. Something was off. Orson stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the dust-covered floorboards. The sound was swallowed by the heavy silence. The figures did not stir. He moved closer, his pulse hammering. Their shoulders were too stiff. Their heads were tilted at just the same unnatural angle. Their hair, their clothing, something about them lacked the natural imperfections of life. He swallowed hard. The nearest figure sat with its hands folded, its head bowed, a woman in a funeral dress, her veil draped over her face like a moth-eaten shroud. Orson reached out. His fingers brushed fabric, then something harder beneath. Not flesh, not bone. Wood. A mannequin. The realization sent a cold shock through his veins. He jerked his hand back. The figure did not react. None of them did. His gaze swept the room. The weight of 100 wooden eyes pressed against him. No, not wood. Most of them had no eyes at all, just smooth, featureless faces. Dust clung to their clothing, their rigid hands. They had been here a long time. But the air was not stale. Something in this place was breathing. The pulpit stood ahead, empty but expectant. A book lay open on the lectern, its pages yellowed with age. The edges curled slightly, as though someone had been turning them again and again. Orson hesitated. Then, against every instinct, he stepped forward. He glanced once more at the congregation. They did not move. The dust was undisturbed, but he swore that their postures had changed. He turned back to the book. The pages were blank. No sermon, no words, nothing. A flicker at the edge of his vision. He blinked. A single line had appeared on the page. "You are not the first to read this, Orson Glass." The air in the church shifted. The mannequins, silent, watching, waiting, felt closer. A sound, deep, rhythmic, coming from beneath the floorboards. Thump. A pause. Thump. Slow, steady, like a heartbeat. Orson's breath quickened. The sensation of being watched thickened around him, wrapping tight around his throat. Then, a bell. The same deep, shuddering chime from the night before. It rolled through the air, vibrating in his ribs, in his skull, shaking the dust loosed from the rafters. Darkness. Orson woke with a start. The bell was still ringing, soft now, distant, fading into the spaces between his thoughts. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his breath unsteady. The air in the room was heavy, thick with something unseen. A dream. Then, a single, solitary tick. A sharp, deliberate sound, not loud, but precise. His stomach twisted. He turned his head toward the darkness of the room. His breath slowed, ears straining. Nothing followed. No second tick, no settling of the house, just silence. Orson swallowed and reached for his watch, flicking it open with stiff fingers. Midnight. He exhaled. It was nothing, just the house, just his nerves. Still, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, pushing himself upright. The floorboards felt colder than they should. A quiet sense of dread followed him as he moved through the house. The walls stretched in the dimness, the shadows seeming to thicken in the corners. Downstairs, the air was heavier, the stillness pressing against his skin. And then he saw it, the grandfather clock. It stood exactly as it always had, its ornate face dim in the low light, the pendulum motionless, frozen mid-swing. But the minute hand, 11:55. Orson's pulse pounded in his ears. It had ticked forward. It had moved. A memory flickered at the edges of his mind. Hadn't he heard it last night too? The solitary tick? He hadn't thought to check then. His breath came, slow and shallow. He stood there for a long moment, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. But the air had shifted. Something was different now. The house was watching. Exhaustion pulled at him, dragging him back toward bed. He climbed the stairs with slow, heavy steps, his limbs sluggish, waited. He told himself it was just a dream, that the bell had never rung. The clock was just an old, broken thing. The house was just a house. He laid down, pressing his palms over his eyes, willing sleep to take him. Eventually, it did. He dreamed. At first, the images were fractured, flickering. A room, soft light filtering through lace curtains, a chair beside the bed, the fabric worn, the wooden arms grooved by the press of restless fingers. A voice, distant, muffled, "Not yet, please, not yet." A bassinet, empty. The weight of silence, the terrible, suffocating quiet where sound should have been. Orson felt himself turn, his breath shallow, his movements sluggish like moving through water. A woman sat in the chair. She faced away from him, her head bowed, her dark hair spilling over one shoulder. Her hands were folded in her lap. Too still, too delicate. Something was wrong. Orson's throat tightened, his chest ached with something old, something familiar. He wanted to reach for her, wanted to tell her he was sorry, wanted to tell her anything. Before he could move, the chair was empty. The window was open. The curtains fluttered in the wind, whispering like voices in the dark. The floor creaked behind him. He turned. A bell rang. Orson jolted awake, gasping. The dream clung to him, its weight pressing against his chest like a stone. His body ached, his limbs were heavy, stiff. Exhaustion settled deep in his bones, dragging him down even as he forced himself upright. The house was quiet, but it did not feel empty. He stumbled toward the bathroom, rubbing at his face. His reflection met him in the dim light. Hollow eyes, the sharp lines of his face more pronounced than they had been the night before. He turned the faucet on and splashed cold water onto his skin. He took a deep breath. When he looked up again, his reflection lingered just a second too long before moving with him. His breath caught in his throat, a slow exhale. He pressed his fingers against his temples. He was imagining things. He needed sleep, he needed... Something made him stop. A small, mundane thing, something he had done 1,000 times before. His eyes flickered to the door, his shoes sitting neatly where he had left them the night before, their soles caked in dried mud. Orson's breath came in slow and shallow. He stared at them, his pulse loud in his ears. He did not remember going outside, but something in him already knew the answer. The air in the house felt thick, weighted, waiting. And as much as he tried to deny it, Orson Glass knew the house was waiting as well.